Okay, so now no one has to know that we didn't actually start now. All right, so thank you again. The source sheet is there. I might have some repetition at the end because I was, okay, but here we go. So let's. I want to begin by talking about some challenges to the Land for Peace paradigm, which we talked about in part one, and yet despite some successes like the peace agreement with Egypt, a really important event in Israeli history, sort of hasn't led to ultimate peace and seems to have stalled. So one weakness with this paradigm is it presents like a false dichotomy or a false arrangement. I'm not sure if I'm articulating this well, where Jews need peace and Arabs need land, right? If I'm trading something, it's like I trade something that I have that you want, and you give me something that you have that I want. And that's not, sort of sets up like right, like everyone needs, like both sides need peace and security and dignity and freedom, right? That's actually a universal need that all people need, that all people deserve. And I think the Land for Peace paradigm kind of doesn't always honor that. It presents reality as though that were not the case. Second, it may presume a kind of secular orientation, which is not helpful in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. Okay, where two cultures that are quite traditional and quite religious are in the long-standing, very violent conflict, and the way, and it's not necessarily a necessary component of Land for Peace, as we saw last, but the way it was implemented, it kind of leave behind, forgo some claim that is like core to your identity in order for this this like peace agreement, this negotiated arrangement, right? And in fact, that's how those are the people who were negotiating on both sides were fairly secular, highly educated, Western oriented, under the auspices of the sponsorship of first of the Norwegians and Oslo and the Europeans and the Americans, and like very, and they were trading away things that were like sort of core values of of the communities in which they came from. And so aside from the content itself of any negotiated agreement, there was a sense that this agreement represented, I'm most familiar within the Jewish-Israeli context, the sense that forget about the agreement, forget about like the people in the government, the negotiators are turning Israel into, a state like any other, into a kind of European-oriented, American-oriented country. And that's like sort of what the end game is. Like we can forgo our ancient biblical heartland and gain access to trading partners around the world and plug ourselves into like the global capital markets and et cetera. And in fact, what happened is, even without the peace agreement, that's what happened to Israel. Israel did plug itself into these global capital markets, and a startup nation was sort of launched since the Oslo years. And Israel it's become much more Westernized and much less uniquely Jewish in many, many important ways of the last 20, 30 years. So everything they feared happened anyway, but that was certainly a fear, right? Of what peace represented. It represented modernization, secularization. I think this was a similar dynamic on the Palestinian side. You're trading away, the right to our ancestral homes, to our sacred homeland, and you're negotiating with it so that we can, again, sort of be a modern country, which is not necessarily always appealing, right? It's appealing in some ways as it's unappealing in other ways. Certainly to a traditional society, sort of being modern is a double-edged sword. And finally, it and the other dynamic is the flip side of this, that the people doing the negotiating, I've sort of spoken this before, the people doing the negotiating were not the ones who were giving up anything they cared about, right? I mean, this is also it's a sort of like an inherent flaw in the way negotiations, like the people weren't negotiating over things they cared deeply about. They were negotiating about things other people cared about. Other Jews cared about our biblical heartland, not the people who are negotiating. And so I think it's like a problematic dynamic. It's a dynamic that doesn't set you up for success. when you're negotiating over something that you fundamentally doesn't mean much to you, but it means a lot to other people, on your side, within your community. There was some story like I think there was some retreat, some European trip for I think this is before Oslo, the Madrid Peace Conference, in Madrid, like the reception that was served to the diplomats from both sides were it wasn't kosher food, so it was and nor was it compliant with Muslim traditions either. So it was just doubly, and that was not a problem for anyone there. Okay, that's not who they were. That's not what their priorities were. Okay, and then the final thing is that it sort of led to a calcification of a status quo, which is not bad enough to induce difficult changes, right? That's the paradigm. We're gonna, it's sort of I have this and I want that, and we're gonna trade. But in the meantime, I have this and you have that. And as long as that status quo is sufficiently tolerable or insufficiently intolerable, then you could have no progress for year after year and then decade after decade. And I think that's it's sort of astounding, right? But that there's not only has there been no progress, there's been no urgency, no sense that anyone even talks about it. Israel had 5 Knesset elections in the last 4 years, and maybe only 4 elections. I don't want to exaggerate. And this was just not an issue for any of the parties that were campaigning, right? Because it's tolerable. The status quo is fine for most Israeli Jews. It's fine. The suffering is kept far enough away from them that it's just not, right? So land for peace, okay. So in the meantime, we'll have the land, and that's fine. So the app, right, and so there's different. Whereas another way of framing it, again, as I said, you could frame it as another way to frame the problem is all human beings from the river to the sea deserve to live in peace, security, dignity, and freedom. And the denial of that is unsustainable ethically. It's unsustainable. That Israel has a need for not giving up land to get peace, but Israel has a need to be a Jewish state. Like the Zionist dream is a Jewish state at peace with its neighbors, secured by international law. Israel isn't really a Jewish state if 50% of the inhabitants under the control of the state of Israel aren't Jewish and have no desire, right? If rightful government is governs with the consent of the governed, and that doesn't exist in Israel. There is no consent of the governed. They're ruled by force. 50% of the power, 50% of the population. So that's I would think, an acute need for some resolution, for some change, not for peace, for a state, right? It's not. What Israel gets in return is not for ending its control over the entirety of Eretz Yisrael. Is not necessarily peace. It's a state, right? So a Jewish state, right, which kind of only exists by mirage right now, from some ways, some advantages. So I think so for all these reasons and others, I think the land for peace paradigm is kind of tired and doesn't seem to be animating progress in a way, after being useful in earlier. So I want to share some sort of other perspectives of some other things that are happening, other initiatives there. And a lot of this material comes from something which I've spoken about before, the Religious Peace Initiative, which is its own organization, started by, I think, Rabbi Melchior. And I'll say the other sort of newsy kind of thing of the Religious Peace Initiative, these are a group, an organization that's fostered very high level dialogues, conversations, and partnerships between very well-respected, influential Israeli rabbis and very well-respected, influential Muslim clerics, including it's not about our secular liberals and your secular liberals will meet in Madrid and eat non-kosher food together. It's like the people with the most religious authority, coming from the most conservative, quote unquote, anti-peace constituencies, are meeting to try to form common bonds. And these have been very, very fruitful conversations. And they have stopped violence that was at risk of spiraling out of control. They have negotiated, concrete actions. And the breakthrough of the this Islamist party sitting in the current Israeli coalition with, headed by Mansour Abbas. That comes from this like decades long, partnership between the Israeli Islamic movement and like religious leaders in Israel as well. So there is a like, and I can share. I don't want to. It's like worth reading into. They actually have a very nice website now, which shares some of the history of their trips and their joint statements and the dialogues they've done and then the initiatives they've undertaken. So I think they're very good. And on their website, they have this very, very helpful article by Roe Ravitsky. I think it's like a 4-page article. I think it's brilliant. So there's a link. You should read the whole thing, but I have some quotes. So here's one approach. The issue of sovereignty appears to stir the hearts and minds of so many, not because of something intrinsic to it, but rather because of the assumption that it's a prerequisite for the realization of all other hopes. Legal sovereignty over the territory functions as a kind of finger in the dike without which all the other aspirations will be washed away, preventing action of any kind in the desired direction, because the ability to operate in the Temple Mount compound is directly dependent on who controls it. Is this a foregone conclusion? Why have to care about sovereignty? According to a prominent Jerusalem sheikh, there is no problem with Jews coming to pray in the mosque esplanade. They can even build themselves a synagogue there and worship Allah in their own way, but this cannot be said aloud, because right now it's not a question of religious law that we are discussing, but rather the less important and more urgent one of who the proprietor is. As long as the Jews do not come to pray, but rather to demonstrate ownership and continue the occupation, we cannot give them a foothold. The sheikh's offers a different paradigm from the one we have become accustomed to. And according to his words and philosophy, there is an inverse relationship between Israel's sovereignty and control over the Temple Mount and the freedom of Jews to worship on it. It would be intriguing to see what certain religious groups would decide were there a choice between the current situation, which Israel has sovereignty, but is limited in its ability to operate on the ground, and a hypothetical one, which Israel gives up its sovereignty, thereby creating a situation that actually increases the capacity of Jews to fulfill their religious aspirations. Okay, so in other words, for the last, since 1967, the Temple Mount Har Bayit has been under Israeli sovereignty, but it's been operated by the Muslim religious authority, the Waqf. There's been restrictions on Jewish access. It's like an ongoing, there's been actually an erosion of the status quo. More Jews are going up and praying more, which is understood to be provocative, and it's illegal by Israeli law right now, right? Muslims pray, non-Muslims visit. That's the status quo that's existed since 1967. It's being undermined by I think let's say a very sincere desire on the part of many Jews to pray on Har Bayit, but that's mixed with a political desire to assert Jewish sovereignty over Har Bayit. So maybe you can't why sovereignty? It's not a religious concept. It's not a necessary religious concept. Right? What are our actual interests? It's like the story of the brother and the sister fighting. It was one orange, and they both want it, and they're fighting over the orange. You know the story, okay? And then after fighting over the orange for a long time, they realize one wants the orange to zest the peel to make a cake, and the other wants the juice to make juice for something, right? And so actually, there was no conflict whatsoever. Right? Their interests. Sometimes you can have an intense conflict, and with a little bit of investigation, you realize that there's actually no conflict at all. And from a religious Muslim perspective, it may be fine for Jews to pray on Har Bayit. And from a religious Jewish perspective, is it really important to us who has sovereignty? What's important to us is that we can have access to the most sacred site in Judaism on Har Bayit. And maybe there's a way, if we can sort of by relinquishing a little bit, we actually gain more of what's most important. And Har Bayit has been a sticking point in negotiations in the past. Who has sovereignty? Like maybe, I don't know, let's say God has sovereignty, okay? It's a non-territorial area. It's sovereignty, direct sovereignty of God. And it'd be administered, this group will pick up the garbage, and this group will, make sure there are no pickpockets, and this group will give out umbrellas when it rains, and it's under the sovereignty of God, okay? Like that might be a satisfying way that can meet everyone's needs maximally. It's to sort of sidestep political fights by kind of honoring, elevating kind of the religious interests at stake at a religious site like Har Bayit. Not necessarily a solution for every inch of Eretz Israel, but I think it's a paradigm that I think could be very effective. And the author goes on to say something similar could also create religious legitimacy for a Jewish state within an Islamic worldview that sees all of historic Palestine as sacred Waqf land that has to be part of a caliphate. So maybe you could say again, why do you have to, that second paragraph there? Suppose a caliphate is established and Jews remain living in it. After all, under Islamic law, they are entitled to live, manage their own affairs on their own, reside in their own community with their own legal system. What prohibits them from doing it as a collective and calling it a state? Okay, and this is actually, since I think this was published, there have been like Islamic chuvot, okay, like extensive halachic literature from an Islamic perspective, justifying a Jewish state in Waqf land, I think with a similar paradigm. And the posek of the Islamic movement is the one who published this book length tshuva. So that's doable. Like there's religious traditions have a lot of flexibility, a lot of capacity to accommodate new realities, and sometimes it's just about like reframing. Okay, instead of seeing it as a like I think in politics is like it's either mine or yours. It's very binary. A piece of land is either it's part of country A or country B. That's like the function of modern nationalism, that you take a map and you make straight lines across the map, and and you're either one side or the other, and it's very stark. And there's no gradual, like it's just one or the other. And I think religious law gives you a way to say, well, actually, if I, it's like imagine you're like like you're building an A-roof. You say, oh, I'm standing here on the street. They're like, well, actually, no, because look at that hedge over there is 10 tefachim tall, and I see it comes within, there's a sloping of ground there. Actually, it looks like I'm in the middle of a urban square, but actually I'm in an entirely enclosed area with halachic boundaries. And if I just squint and put on my halachic glasses, I can like see the situation from a whole different area, and I'm in a private domain I can carry on Shabbos. Right? I think that's the capacity of like kind of a religious worldview. You can kind of just like shift your perspective and see everything differently. So like you can say like, okay, so yes, this is, sacred Muslim land that's part of the caliphate, but like, okay, like why is, a pan-Arab caliphate inconsistent with Jews having an independent Jewish state? It's actually not inconsistent. We thought they were, they're actually not. With a religious perspective, within a desire for peaceful relations, it's not necessarily in conflict. So that's again another example, like kind of a religious, this is actually not, it's not a Jewish religious tool, but it's an example of how I think elevating and foregrounding religious perspectives can like get past an impasse that has stopped like a secular politician. So, okay, the other piece, I alluded to this earlier, this paragraph is expressed, I think, very poignantly. The camp that currently fiercely opposes a peace agreement is the one that will end up paying for it with the total eradication of its life work when the time comes, while the camp that is proudly leading peace efforts will end up paying nothing at all. In this situation, the political debate in Israel has ceased to be a mere dispute about necessary policy measures. When those that stress the importance of compromise do not themselves have to make any concessions, any victory for them would mean overwhelming defeat for an entire political and ideological camp. Those who seek to increase support for an agreement should ask themselves what price its supporters may have to pay and how its opponents might benefit from it. Okay, so that's, I think this is, I thought I said earlier, one of the flaws of the land for peace paradigm, that the people negotiating, like they're not, a diplomat living in a fancy neighborhood in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and global Israel is not feeling the pain of a withdrawal from the biblical heartland. But the people who live there, who invested 3 generations in building Jewish communities there, they're the ones who pay that price. They're not the ones who see the benefit, and they're the ones who pay the price. So that's a dynamic that leads to more opposition and doesn't lead to any ability to have a cohesive internal Jewish commitment, progress towards peace. So this author suggests, okay, if you want to take away my home, promise that you'll let me into yours. I'll bring a backpack filled with a Talmud, and if you pledge that we will sit down together, the whole family, to learn in your living room, then I'll consider agreeing to pack my bags. Otherwise, a country without Judea, in what way would it be Jewish? Okay, they understand that the peace process had been a secularizing, modernizing process. And so if you want a more traditional religious community to be involved and supportive, they have to get something out of it too. I thought that image is very poignant. You want me to leave my home? You're going to kick me out of my home in the context of an agreement, so let me into yours, okay? And I'm coming with my traditions, okay? And we're going to learn them together, okay? Because, right. And I think that also is a way that it's not a policy prescription. It's a way of thinking, okay? It's a way of thinking that builds coalitions rather than destroys the possibility of coalition. Okay, I've said a lot so far. I want to pivot in a moment, but I just, this essay to me is very meaningful. I don't know, I've shared some of it before with some of you, but questions or comments or reactions?
I would just say the last piece about let me learn in your home, bring me into your home.
Yeah.
It's actually rather insulting, because what I'm hearing there is that the only way to be a proper Jew is to live in this space. And the only way to be a knowledgeable Jew is to live in this space. There are plenty of folks who can meet those criteria who don't live in those spaces. And I think that's too narrow a lens, and quite frankly, insulting.
Yeah, thank you, Benjamin. I didn't quite see it that way. I saw it as, and in fact, the flip side, I don't know if I could find I think it was David Grossman, who was an Israeli author and a peace activist. I think he said something to the effect of, this again during the Oslo years, right? To an audience of West Bank settlers, right now we're political opponents, but once peace comes, we're going to be allies because both of us are committed to making it, strengthening Israel's Jewish identity and its distinctiveness and its distinct, uniquely Jewish culture. We're actually allies in that battle once we can resolve this battle. And I think that's sort of how I understood it. That Shimon Peres had a book, The New Middle East, and it was a very, if you remember the 90s, like that during the time when people were optimistic that this type of we can forgo our ancient biblical heartland because that's not really all that important. What's important is, peace gives us access to global capital markets and trading partners and prosperity. Those, I don't know, prosperity is nice, but that's not what's most important, right? To me and my community, that's not most important. And we've, again, invested blood, sweat, toil in building Jewish communities in our biblical heartland. So don't, I need something. I need to, if you're telling me that this contribution to the Jewish people isn't meaningful anymore, and is going to be eradicated. So you need to, you're asking me to accept total defeat. And he's saying, okay, but let's compromise on that, right? Because you diplomat, you secular leftist, you're not compromising anything. You don't care about, these locations. They don't mean anything to you. But I hear you. Yeah, it comes from a place of asserting a certain, set of practices and beliefs and cultural tools. It has its pride of place in Jewish identity. So it's just presuming that, which is can be an offensive position. Does that help you feel more sympathy with it, Benjamin, or you still feel?
No, I'm not going to be flipped.
Okay, fine. Sorry. All right.
No, it's okay.
All right.
I just think, to suggest that if you say there's an absence of Judaica in the public school system, and you want to increase that, and that's in the spirit of the welfare of the entirety of the Jewish community, I can support that and I can actually appreciate that. If you tell me that the increase in Judaica in a public school system has to be the cost of removing religious Zionists from what is a historical Eretz Yisrael, I think that's a flawed bit of logic. I can't ever rally behind that idea, because it's saying, as long as we can live here, I don't really care what happens to you in your not historical Eretz Yisrael boundaries.
Well, okay, I'll say one more. Okay, I'll say one more point, because what's actually happened, right there, in the absence of the representatives of religious Zionism in the Knesset, and otherwise, right, in their have basically prioritized in their policies that they've supported over the last 30, 40 years, the continued investment of massive state resources in expanding the settlement enterprise at the cost of anything else they might have used their political leverage for, right? It's very blatant. You can see in all the factions in the Knesset and the coalitions they form, and you only get, you get a certain number of things, and other things you're not going to get. And so, they religious, the religious Zionists, they, have given up on fighting for their form of Judaism in the, the rabbinate, the chief rabbinate has been given over to ultra-Orthodox interests, and all sorts of efforts to reform, modernize and make improvements to the system, the marriage system, and et cetera, and the conversion system and the state right, et cetera. That's all been defeat after defeat after defeat over, over decades, because all their chips, all of their leverage has been deployed on strengthening and expanding the settlement enterprise. So they've actually made the opposite choice. That like actually our community's values are going to be expressed through, in this way, and we're just not going to have the leverage. Therefore, we won't have leverage to fight for these other priorities, right? So that's sort of the opposite. So that's sort of the opposite choice. And I think this like, well, maybe what would the reverse choice look like? What if secular Israelis were going to compromise too, and bringing the settlers back home to sovereign Israel? What would we compromise and bring them back to live amongst us, right? Is secular Israel really prepared for that? I don't know. I found it provocative. I understand. Okay, but I want to move. But thank you for expressing your dissent. I'm going to move on now. So the next series of the final thing. This is a quote from that same article from an anonymous rabbi he interviewed, who said, "If we Jews believe that our return to the Holy Land to establish a state in it is part of the divine plan and the fulfillment of the prophecy, then we must also believe that the presence of another people in the land is part of the same divine plan. On the basis of this belief, it is clear to me that we must resolve the conflict between us, not because fate has decreed that we must live here together, but because we are fortunate that fate has destined us to live here together and fulfill God's will." So here's the first real clear articulation of a theology of peace that's really quite different from anything we saw last week, right? I think there's in the land for peace paradigm, there's sort of like this sense, like we just, woke up one morning and the Palestinians had all decided to move to Hawaii. Like that would be great, because then we could just stay. Then we wouldn't have to trade anything, right? That would be just have it all, and that would be best, right? And this text is saying that the religious Zionist theory of history, okay, let's say via Rev Kook, maybe via his philosophy Rebbe Hegel, is that history itself is a venue in which God's will is expressed as history unflows, okay, stage after stage after stage. And if we see the Jewish return to Eretz Israel as part of this redemptive divine plan, then we can't discount and ignore the circumstances under which that happened, which is that we returned to a land that was full of other people, in towns and cities and villages from one end to the other. And that also must be part of God's plan. And so with this perspective, it's not a plan B, oh dear, we live in a flawed world, let's make the best of it. No, actually, it's a theology of, no, this is our purpose. This is like part of God's plan, that we're here with them and we got to make it work together. I personally find this incredibly moving, and it just seems so I think it's very logical, right? Because I think a lot, religious Zionists speak all the time about history as reflecting God's unfolding plan, but like you can't, if that's the language you're going to speak, if that's the way those are the lenses you're going to view reality, then you got to view the whole reality. Yeah, like it's this incredible thing, the ingathering of the exiles from the four corners of the earth to a land where other people are already living. Okay, so the point is we got to figure out a way to live together. I think it's a political reality, right? And I think if we don't figure out a way to live together, one of us will annihilate the other or both. So somehow we're gonna have to figure this out, and that's God's plan. And I think the impact of that is transformative, right? I think that will change the world. I think it will transform the world if we can, because given the attention of the world, the importance of this place, the spiritual energy of this place, if we figure out a way to live in peace there, I really do believe that would transform the world. So that's a really different theology, and I think a really powerful one. Again, it doesn't solve any of the questions, but it creates a motivation where peace is not a concession, but is actually a response to a divine call, right? If you seeing God's hand in history. Okay. So I don't know who this anonymous rabbi is. He may have been Rav Froman. Okay. I met on one occasion, incredible person, a mystic, a poet, one of the founding residents of the West Bank settlements of Tekoa, and a peace activist, and a religious peace activist. And he met with everyone. He felt, again, peace is not going to be made by the secular diplomats on each side to be made by the strong religious fanatics on each side. Those are the ones who are going to make peace. He had at least cultivated a friendship with Sheikh Yassin, the founder of Hamas. When Sheikh Yassin was freed from Israeli prison, Rav Froman went to Gaza and visited him there. And he was not, was not ignorant of all of the death and destruction that, were caused by Hamas, but he felt, this is the person we have to make peace with, and you make peace by talking, and he spoke with everyone. So some of his relevant quotes, he says here, okay, many people cannot accept that the call to freedom can also be a religious matter. Despite what the rabbis taught, that there is no free person other than one who is involved in Torah, most religious people are still educated to believe that they must renounce their freedom for the sake of religion. This is found in other spheres. For example, in the political sphere, most settlers think that settlements are an obstacle to peace. Rather, they prefer settlements to peace. They cannot understand that settlements are for the sake of peace, and so too between men and women. Many men think that to be free is to be single, and to get married is to give up your freedom for the sake of a woman, relationship, children, house, etc. But for me, freedom is itself a religious value. My wife is my freedom. As the poet said, with you I know that I am only free with you. And this point, Rav Froman would begin to sing and to cry. Okay, very emotional person. Okay, and this is written by one of his students. Okay. And settlements are fingers of a hand outstretched in peace and that protect peace. At this point, he would show his hand and how when one shakes hands, one's fingers are in the palm of the other person's hand, and he compared them to settlements that exist in the heart of the Palestinian population. So it's these are the settlements represent the Jewish communities that are surrounded by Palestinian communities in the midst, nestled in between Palestinian cities and villages, etc. And that is an opportunity for peace, because that's where the populations are encountering each other. Potentially, there could be the opportunity for peace. His daughter-in-law was attacked in a terror attack I think also in Tekoa or some similar nearby settlement where she lived a few years ago. She survived. It was a stabbing attack. She survived, and she, reached out to try to cultivate. I mean, it was like a 16-year-old kid who attacked her, and she reached out to cultivate some sort of bond with her attacker, subsequent to her recovery. And she formed an organization in her settlement of, and neighboring settlements of Jews trying to interact with their Palestinian neighbors in the West Bank. Right, that's a hand outstretched in peace. And we had speakers at the shul from Shorashim a few years ago, which is a comparable or a similar worldview. Okay, these are West Bank settlers and their Palestinian neighbors finding neutral spaces to meet and to dialogue and to learn about each other. And there's it's you can't escape from it, the politics and the power dynamics and the broader context, but at least in theory, people living in proximity to each other can be an ingredient for peace. Okay, Rav Froman, was a mystic, so mystics don't have to make sense, right? Not everything. Mystics are able to say things that for me to say, it would be like, how is it possible? How can you, how can you possibly say the settlements are a hand outstretched in peace and, and the fingers of a hand are, but from a mystical perspective, that's what he very much believed. And whatever political program follows from that, it's not for me to say, but as a theology or as a religious philosophy of peace, I think it's quite powerful. And for Froman, again, felt like, we're here, here I am living in Tekoa, what a perfect opportunity for me to be that ambassador of Israel to the Palestinians, because I'm the one who lives amongst them, not somebody in a big city. So you want to see another, I'll pause your questions, comments on Rav Froman and the anonymous rabbi before we move on. Any objections, Benjamin? All right, so there's another question.
No objection, but I think it's a question of perspective. If I appreciate what he says, and it's the spirit that he's saying with, and I understand what he says, but the other audience receiving this message might say, actually, it wasn't fingers interlaced with fingers, it's finger poked into eye. So
it's a fist. Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
It's a two-part relationship.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true, and I don't want to deny that, and that's in the news this week in a really painful way, and I don't want to deny that.
I
But
don't say that to say that that's my opinion, but I'm just saying
no, I understand.
when
I
you
understand.
let
No,
politics and we let other factors in, it can change
yeah.
it.
Right. So I'm trying, I'm not, I don't feel like I'm qualified to speak about policy or politics, but as a presenting kind of ways in which Judaism can be right. I mean, that could be true even whatever Israel and any borders could be seen, right? I mean, I think there's a way that Israel is spoken about, in the, let's say in the American Christian right, whatever Zionism at this point is mostly a Christian phenomenon, right? There are, more Christian Zionists. Christian Zionists outnumber Jews in America by like 20-1, right? And so in Christian Zionism, there's a flavor of Christian Zionism which sees Israel as this like bastion of Western civilization, this like spear point of Western civilization, that's like our foothold in the Middle East. And I think Froman is saying no, it's the opposite. Like we're the bridge between civilizations. Like we're a place we can to be a bridge, not a spear point, but a place where a mediator point where where different cultures and civilizations and religions can interact with each other and in peace rather than in a like more aggressive way. Okay, another quote of his, which I think also is very okay. In truth, it's a significant matter for him, or Froman, that he returned to constantly in his speech and in his actions. How can faith not turn into opacity? And in this regard, he constantly quoted what Bialik wrote: "I shall go into the field and hear." Oh, not here. Sorry, it should be a typo. And hear HEAR, and hear what God has said from the sheaves. And he said this this is true humility. And he returned to this many times and said, "Humility is reality." And so was in many spheres. For example, the political sphere. Once he saw one of the students in the yeshiva who was going around with a T-shirt that said on it, "If there are no Arabs, there will be no terror attacks." Okay, in Hebrew, "Ein Arabim, ein terror." I've seen that T-shirt. Okay, very ugly sentiment. And he turned to him, that student, and he said in front of everyone, "And what should we do when there are Arabs? What do you do when there are?" And he repeated and said this many, many times, that the basis for any political thinking is that unlike our ideological prior assumptions, the Holy Blessed One places us in a land that has Arabs. This is reality. This is what Hashem says to us. Know from the sheaves. And he particularly emphasized this point at the end of his life when his illness was revealed to him. The doctor said it was an advanced stage and he did not have much time to live. And he immediately began to prepare himself for death. And he learned and taught about this from the Zohar and other books. And many people around him, from the family and from his students, etc., they tried to encourage him, saying that he should not despair and should believe that he could still emerge from his illness and live. And he said everything is possible for the blessed God to do. And then he continued to prepare for death. And I saw by him, from the one hand, penetrating understanding of the facts with all the difficulty they contained and full acceptance of reality. On the other hand, the gaze did not turn into someone who despaired or to someone who was passive. Okay. Okay. So this piece here, this also to me remind to see the reality, the challenges of sharing a land, it's homeland of two peoples, a bloody conflict of 100 years, right? This is the reality that God, kind of laid out for us to confront. And so sort of fantasies of, prior assumptions of what redemption would look like, what the Jewish return to Eretz Yisrael would look like, what the society would build there would look like those prior assumptions are just moots, okay? They have to be ignored because we have to build something based on the reality that exists right now. And the reality that exists right now is we're sharing this land with a non-Jewish population. 50% of the population of Eretz Yisrael is not Jewish. We have to figure out a way to live with them. Okay, so you have a T-shirt. Oh, if there were no Arabs, X, Y, and Z, but there are. Okay, there are. Hashem brought us to a land where there are other people. Okay, and now we need to work. We need to figure something out. I think also, again, it's like a theology of peace. It's very different from land for what's at last. I think it's very different. It's a theology of seeing the reality as an expression of God's will and as an expression of God's message to us. God's communicating to us through the reality that we find ourselves in. The Jewish people find ourselves, Am Yisrael Yishev Etzion, the portion of our people that's living in Eretz Yisrael, they find themselves living in a country with a 50% non-Jewish population, and they got to figure out how to make that work. Okay, 1 state, 2 states, 5 states, whatever, no states. Okay, I don't know, but they have to figure out a way to make it work. That's God's message. Okay, He brought us to a land that has non-Jews living there too. I did meet. I have met actually a Facebook friend with a Palestinian man who does a lot of work in dialogue groups now, like that's sort of like one of his like activities. And he, the first time I met him, he mentioned to me that he had like learned Zohar with Ref Froman. Because he saw I was wearing a kippah, it's like, did you know Ref Froman? I said, I did. I met him once, and he said, okay, so we learned Zohar together. So like, he had dialogue partners. He had people on the other side who respected him greatly. He didn't have influence, he didn't have power, but he didn't have power. So any political program that he might have promoted, if he would have, didn't pan out. But I think his influence is growing. So the other person I want to introduce you to is Rav Shigar, who also is no longer alive, and also has become Shigar is extremely famous after his death. When he was alive, he was influential, but like since I don't know how many books of his were published. Since his death, dozens of books of his have been published. They're starting to be translated into English. It's like very, sort of cutting edge religious thought now. He's the great thinker in contemporary Judaism. Again, he's been dead for 5 years or so, but whatever. Okay, we'll say contemporary, and more or less, who really grapples with postmodernism and the challenges of like the age in which we're living, in which ideologies are suspect, ideologies have failed, the old paradigms don't work. And people are searching for something new. Some of us studied Rav Shigar, I guess last summer into the fall, prior to before Mincha on Shabbos afternoon, and whatever it was, the spring. So I don't know. We spent a bunch of weeks reading Rav Shigar, a few of us at the shul, and I found some of his ideas incredibly compelling. This Hebrew passage is from an essay of his on Sukkot. Ma korek asher yachzei koach mishtanim, kasher uma hagola hamifurezet b'chol olam mitzad ma'alata hofechet l'ribon b'territoria. What happens when the relationship to power changes? When a nation exiled and spread out on every corner of the earth as an expression of its greatness, right? Because the Jews are not limited by any particular space. We're universal. We're God's special people. We live everywhere. What happens when we turn into a sovereign nation with a defined territory? Is it true that now, when we've merited sovereignty, yitzor behechrech hazichron hahistori shel anshea kemenutzachim v'golim bechavlei eretz shonim? Do we have to create by necessity the historic memory of people who were defeated and exiled throughout the world? Yachas minukar ve'avon v'toshavim hazarim be'kirvam, right? To be a foreign minority everywhere. Okay, move on yoter concrete, in a more concrete way. Hayim chazarto shel Am Yisrael politika ha'olamit shata azav mi'onesh sheyesh bo ratzon pnimi tovilu lehityaches Lazar hachai bekirbo, kfi shehityachasu elav umot halam kasher gala be'artzotayim. Let me translate that. It's a long sentence. Okay, and there are two allusions in that sentence. And I'm watching. Okay, the Kuzari, right? I'm going to take a little step back. Okay, because this is actually a much older question. Kuzari, famous book of medieval Jewish philosophy, constructed as a dialogue between the king of the Khazars and this Chacham, this Jewish sage, and they debate and talk about religion and stuff. And the climax is, the Khazar king becomes Jewish because the Chacham convinces him of how great Judaism is. Okay, but it's a very important foundational work of medieval Jewish philosophy. It is translated to English. It's a classic. It's worth reading. There are two questions that the Khazar king asks the Chacham that the Chacham can't answer. And he says, "Oh, you stumped me. I have no answer." The first is, you speak so beautifully about Eretz Yisrael. If you love it so much, why don't you go there? That's question number one. And the author of the Kuzari, Yehuda Levi, actually, left behind this thriving career as this great author, poet, philosopher in Spain, and did in fact move to Eretz Yisrael at the end of his life. So, okay. Second question that the king of the Khazar says that the Chacham has no answer to is, you Jews, you think you're so morally superior. That's only because you've never had any power. If you had power, you'd be no different than anybody else. And the king says, what can I say? Maybe you're right. I don't know. Okay. So like both of these questions are alive for us, 5782 in a way that they, even more poignantly than they were alive for the king of the Khazar. So Rav Shigar writes, and he's quoting also a famous passage from Rav Kook, that second line. Rav Kook says in one of his really, underappreciated writings that the Jewish people left the world of politics regretfully, but with a certain inner choice and inner will, because we knew that to be politically active during the Dark Ages would require being wicked. And we didn't want to be wicked. And now Rav Kook writes in the 20th century that, there's like a new age dawning and there's brotherhood among all people and there's no more wars anymore. It's appropriate for us to return to politics because we're going to regain our sovereignty in this redemptive messianic reality that is unfolding before us, as we see, happening in, 1920, when, this wonderful, blossoming of humanity, leaving, when everything old and bad has been destroyed. Okay, so that's a famous passage from Rav Kook. He's quoting that passage and saying, okay, yes, we left politics behind. Now we're coming back to it. Do we remember what it was like to be an oppressed minority? And how are we going to treat the minority that lives with us? And that's the test. That's the test of Jewish identity for Rav Shigar, right? Because to be a Jew is to, that's Sukkot, right? It's an agricultural festival celebrating the land of Israel and its harvests that we celebrate by moving out into a hut and renouncing our earthly possessions, remembering what it was like to have no home and to live out in the wilderness and reenact being homeless. And that's what it means to that's Jewish collective life. It's all about Sukkot. It's about can we do that? Can we live in the land and farm it and flourish in the land and also remember what it's like to have no home? And the way we demonstrate that is how we treat the non-Jews who live amongst us. So this passage also, it's a different theology, right? Peace is about instantiating the destiny of the Jewish people to be at home and foreign at the same time. That to remember the sufferings of exile while we're living at home. And we show that by making space for the stranger in our home, by being hospitable. And so that's also, I think that opens up a kind of different avenue. It's like a theology of peacemaking. The concessions are not concessions to those who are stronger than us. The concessions are, no, this is why, this is Jewish history has led us up to this moment of having power and then not using it. Having power and making space for the other. Right, that answers the Kuzari's question. Okay, that's Sukkot. The message of Sukkot. We have a home and we're homeless at the same time. We suffered in Egypt. We suffered in exile, and so we treat the stranger differently. And not as a concession, not because we want access to global capital markets, but because that's what it means to be a Jew. Then Jewish collective memory, Jewish collective identity requires that. All right, running out of time. Let's go. Okay. This is an article, again, the link is there, about Rav Shigar Zionism. He has a beautiful passage about Hatikva. He says Hatikva is so great because it's a wonderful anthem because it speaks about longing, not about achievement. It's not a triumphant song. It's a song of longing for a homeland that you don't yet possess. And he thinks that's a paradigm for Jewish nationalism. We're always yearning for something more. We're never self-satisfied. We're never triumphant. We sing in the minor key and we yearn for something that we don't have yet. Okay, and you can read that passage. I'm going to move on to the Gemara at the end. There's yet another, okay, Sanhedrin 98b. Whole series of pages in Sanhedrin that talk about time of Mashiach and redemption. So, okay, what's the meaning of the phrase, I see kol gever? Rav Bar Yitzchak says, named Rav, it's a reference to he whom all strength is his. Misha kol gvura shelo. Okay, and it is as though God will suffer like a woman in labor due to the troubles of the Jewish people. And what is the meaning of the phrase? And all the faces turn green. Rabbi Amar Yochanan says, "Pam yashal mala, pam yashal mata, b'shasham hakadosh baruch hu lalo masay yadai, v'lo masay yadai heach aved ha'elu mifnei elu." Okay, so this is the angels and above and the entourage below, the Jewish people who all suffer when God says, the Jewish people are my handiwork and the other nations are my handiwork, and I can't destroy one on account of the other. So Rabbi Yochanan is saying redemption entails this difficulty of God not being able to choose us versus our rivals. We're both created by God, in God's image. And Rabbi Yochanan is saying, look, I don't want to live in the times of Mashiach because we're returning to our land, we're going to come into conflict and God's not going to favor us. Okay, why? Next passage. Amar Papa, this is people say, Rahit v'nafal tura v'azil v'shadi le'susia be'ore. Okay, an ox runs and falls. The owner goes and gets a horse and uses the horse instead of the ox. So what does that mean? That means that right, you use an ox to plow. Oxes are very strong. Okay, whatever reason, your ox is out of the picture. So you get a horse, the horse will do just as well, but you're not gonna, once the horse is doing the job, you're not going to replace it. So Rashi says, he sort of explains it, okay, sort of explains this little, thing. Rahid v'nafil tur, the ox runs and falls. The azva shadi susi, or you put a horse in its place. Kashirat, hashor v'nafal v'amidav. Sus b'mkama, when the ox runs and falls, you put a horse in its place. V'avuso, in the yoke of the ox. All right, so you would never put the horse there if you had an ox. The ox is better for this type of work, but you don't have an ox, put the horse there. Okay, and once the ox gets better, not so simple to replace the horse, because the horse now is doing work for you that's valuable and is doing an okay job. Yeah, not maybe the ideal would have had the ox wouldn't have been injured, you would have kept the ox there, but now that you put this horse there, you're not going to just replace it right away. So what's the nimshal? So Kach Kadosh Baruch Hu Kevin Shram Apalatan Shel Yisrael Noten Gdulato LaOvdei Kochavim Goshechozrim Yisrael B'Tshuva V'Nigalin Kashel LaAved Ovdei Kochavim B'Nei Israel. Okay, when Israel sinned and we were exiled from our land, so God gave our glory to other nations. And when we do tshuva and we're redeemed and we return, it's not going to be so simple for God to just replace them with us. So this is also an interesting theology of, the other people we're sharing Eretz Yisrael with, okay? I think, I don't know that necessarily, like Rashi's thinking of like geography per se versus like God's favor in a more abstract way, but I think it also works on the on the level of just like straight geography that this was our land, but like it's not by accident that other people came to live there. Like those are the people God brought into like God's special holy land when we weren't able, we didn't deserve to live there. We deserve this punishment of exile. It's a core element of Jewish theology. Other people were brought in, so the land wouldn't be empty. And once they're there, right, God's kind of happy with the work they're doing. And not so simple for God. God doesn't have any basis to replace them with us. We're all created by God. So it also is a theology, I think, that can motivate, like seeing the other Palestinians per se, right, as legitimate inhabitants of Eretz Yisrael, people brought to Eretz Yisrael by Kadosh Baruch Hu for a purpose that the land should be inhabited always, and that God doesn't want them to leave, like because they fulfilled this job in history, and again we have to figure out some way to sharing and living together. Okay, I don't think I'm, I think. I don't know, I think it's a clear implication, could be a clear implication of Rashi. I heard Rabbi Avi Gisser, who's the Rav of Afra, settlements in the Shomron, share this Gemara with a similar message. And I think it's powerful. Okay, it's 9:01. I don't want to keep you for longer, but if you want to ask a few questions, I can take a few questions or comments or reactions now.
I have a two-part question regarding Har HaBayit.
Yeah.
One is, say we gave sovereignty over to the Arabs and they allowed us to build a synagogue and we had a lot of people that came there. And then how do we know that we won't be kicked out at some point in the future? My second question is, I was told many years ago that Jews don't go up to Har HaBayit because they might be walking on the Holy of Holies.
Yeah, great. So that's the easier question, and that actually has been and maybe still is the Orthodox response to going up to Har HaBayit. It's absolutely forbidden. Almost all of the post-game influential halachic scholars of the last 100 years have said it's forbidden for Jews to ascend Har HaBayit because you don't know exactly where was the precinct of the Beis HaMikdash. You can't go there. There are, however, other poskim who say, no, we actually do know. It's not so hard. And Har HaBayit today is much bigger than the actual precincts of the temple. It's been expanded, over the Herod, made it much bigger. And so you can walk around the perimeter and you're pretty safe. And they have, I'd say it's maybe more modern oriented, trusting of archaeology kind of oriented poskim who say no, they know full well exactly. We know where the Beis HaMikdash is, and we can avoid that. And I would say it was over the last decade, there's been a massive increase in the number of Orthodox Jews who do ascend to Har Bayit. And so now it's, on some days of religious significance, you have thousands go up in a day, hundreds go up some day, like many ascend. They even now have a minyan there. They daven with, like that status quo from 1967 of Muslims pray on Har Bayit and Jews visit has really been undermined. But it hasn't been undermined with the peaceful agreement of all parties. It's been undermined, with one side controlling all the power and another side being very resentful and angry. And so there's a risk that there could be, outbreaks of violence. There have been outbreaks of violence. There could be more. That's the fear. But many Jews go, and I think the arguments again are just we know where the base of Mikdash was. We can just avoid walking on those places. In terms of look, there are risks in everything. You could have an agreement. If you have an agreement, then circumstances could change. But if you don't have an agreement, circumstances could also change, right? I mean, that's sort of what I would say. Like, if you don't have an agreement, then you are safe. So only so long as I think I heard maybe I heard Bibi Netanyahu say this at some APAC conference or something like, Israel has to win every war. Like, we can't lose any war. If we lose any war, there won't be an Israel anymore. So I think he made that as an argument to for a strong military and a strong stance, because you can't lose any war. But I don't know, I'd say, I don't know, maybe that's a reason to not have your survival depends on war. If you live by the sword, how long can that last? You can't guarantee being the strongest forever, right? You can be the strongest for 10 years, for 50 years, but forever is a very long time. And maybe there's it seems to me that if your right to anything is dependent on being stronger than the other guy, there is always a risk of not being stronger than the other guy. Whereas if you can come to a peaceful agreement, that can be very stable. And we have examples. I mean, I don't think that it's inconceivable that France and Germany will ever go to war again, right? I think that's, I don't know, I would say not in my lifetime, not in my children's lifetime, not in my children's life. Just, as far in the future as I can imagine, I can't imagine France and Germany going to war, again against each other. And that would have been, not that long ago, a preposterous thing to suggest, right? I mean, not only in the history of France, right? I mean, you have a French man and his grandchildren sitting on a bench, in the park in Paris. Those are three generations: the grandfather, the son, and the grandson. That's three generations of French men who have lived their entire lives in peace. That's the first time that has happened in the history of France. Okay, and we're living through it right now. Okay, and it should go to a fourth generation too, right? So I don't know, you have people who have really bitter, bloodthirsty conflict for centuries, and then they stop, okay, and then that can also be stable for centuries. So okay, that's my response to that. Any other responses before we wrap up for tonight? If you think of other questions or comments, you can always share them later. But Linda, you're muted. Are you saying something? Linda, you're muted.
Sorry. With a lot of these theologies, I'm troubled. I'm really troubled because I find, the idea that, okay, God, has us leave Israel because we're not worthy of staying there. And he has other people come in and, whatever. To me, that leads to understanding of the Shoah as being something because we were guilty of something. I just see these lines of theology that I think are often used to explain things. I'm sure, I don't mean to say it this way because I'm sure people are espousing them believe what they're saying, but in my mind, they are sort of rationalizations, or can be understood as a rationalization. And if taken to another step or another scenario, I'm not sure that they are as comfortable, at that point. And I think, I was thinking now, just as you were talking about the French, and whatever, and that's true. I mean, and there were 100-year wars and there were, all sorts of horrible things prior to this. And I don't know, there's an intensity in this, the configuration of Israel, and the smallness of it. And I'm trying to think of others, like other states, or even in Italy, where you have the a late start for a nation from city states, and still to this day have tensions I mean, not fighting in terms of arms, but there are still tensions. So maybe that we have many years ahead of us to get to that point where we can have some sort of an equilibrium that allows for both sides to work together. But the theology that you presented doesn't satisfy, it just feels more like a way of understanding something, but that to me is taken to another step. It just is terribly flawed for me.
Interesting. So so first of all, I would say that my teacher of Amital, Zatzal, I think would sympathize with your objection, and he spoke out against this dominant religious Zionist historiography in which we see the unflowering of redemption, like the sun rising, and from the first Aliyah until now, this is like slow redemptive process. And he felt you couldn't, if you took the Holocaust seriously, you couldn't tell that story, because smack in the middle of this story of redemption, the Holocaust occurred, right? So he felt that he was just, the whole thing alienated him, and Rav Kook, of course, who was the expounder of this, died before World War II started, and so like there was a, maybe that kind of Hegelian like progress in history has sort of been, we can't really speak that way anymore. So I think I say fine. I guess I would say maybe leaving aside then, or jettisoning sort of a hard version of this theory that like this is what God is like doing in history, and how and how I would just say, how do I look at the world? How do I experience the world? How do I experience the challenges? Like someone like Rav Froman, right, an Israeli Jew, right, like, or Rav Shagar, like how do I or that anonymous rabbi, how do I see these challenges? Is it I see the need to come to an accommodation with the Palestinian residents of Eretz Israel, not as a grudging concession with a cruel reality that we turn to the land of our dreams and other people living here, oh no, like how little can we get away with, right? Or how much can we, how little can we give them, and still let's pretend they're not there, let's hide hide them behind a wall and pretend they're not there, and just do the bare minimum of concessions, because this is our land, and that our that God promised us, and like that's our core truth. Or can we say, no, like whatever, if we believe that, I think to be religious Zionist to see, well, right. So that's sort of how I'd see it, right? It's a way of seeing the world, and telling myself, no, the coming to an accommodation, welcoming the opportunity to share this land with them is what we're here to do. Okay, I find that very compelling, even if ultimately we can't know God's intentions with and we don't I think you could be a religious Jew who has a secular, and I would say a couple of years ago I would have responded differently. A couple of years ago I would have said you can be a religious Jew who's a Zionist who isn't a religious Zionist, right? You could say Jewish survival and modernity is really precarious, and to have a state of our own is a way to protect our interests and to ensure Jewish survival. And that's why we have a state of our own. And actually it's a secular, kind of endeavor that the Jewish people decided we didn't want to live by miracles anymore. We didn't want to live, out of our portable homeland, the book. We wanted to live in a real homeland again, and, and be able to protect ourselves in material ways with the instruments of a nation state, this new invention, the nation state. We want to use one too. And that was fundamentally a secular endeavor. And that religious Jews partnered with non-religious Jews in this secular endeavor. Okay, that's classic. That's Rav Reines, the founder of the Mizrahi, the founder of the religious Zionist wing of the Zionist movement, who allied himself with Herzl in 1902. Like he said, Zionism has nothing to do with redemption. It's a secular, it's a means by which the Jewish people is going to protect its interests and improve its status in the world. And then you come to peacemaking like any other pragmatic challenge, right? You need to make sure everyone has water, you need to make sure everyone has healthcare, you need to make sure there's electricity, and you need to engage in diplomacy, and you do it, and it's just, like no different than anything else. And I think that was, I don't know, and that's uncomplicated. I think that was my that was my approach again until a few years ago. I think what has changed for me is I think nationalism in general is like a pretty bad idea. I think it was a mistake that human beings made. The invention of the nation state and whatever in 1870, I think was a big mistake, and has not brought peace, stability, protection to really anyone. And the peace that the Germans and the French are enjoying right now is because now they're part of NATO and the EU and the UN, and it's actually the diminishing of nationalism that has created peace and stability. That nation states fail to protect their citizens when things get really dangerous, and so that's part of it. Like, I'm just not impressed by nation states anymore, and I also recognizing that I don't think it's like I think so many people, Jews and Palestinians, are so deeply religious and tied to their heritage. I think the kind of pragmatic secular approach is maybe not going to speak to the hearts of the people who actually need to ultimately embrace a peace agreement and embrace a life of peace. So I think there's a need for a religious framework to inspire people to, make painful concessions and rethink about the world and think about their neighbors in different ways. But thank you for helping me articulate that.
Can I say one more thing? Or ask
yeah.
one question? This also is bringing to mind letters to my Palestinian friend.
Neighbor, yeah.
And the response that he got from a Palestinian reader, I don't remember who he was, but here he is, talking about our narrative, how we're in this land and everything else. And from the other side, it's still that we're an imposition. It's like, so maybe it's our theology, and I certainly enjoy and want that kind of dialogue and everything else. But on the other side of it, what's to say, or how do we know? Or, obviously this comes from speaking with people and with dialogue and everything else, but nonetheless, just looking at it, if we are imposed upon people who are living there, and they don't necessarily have the same kind of sense that God has put us both in this space for a mutual purpose, then we are always the intruder, or always the one that has disrupted, what they have built, or that kind of.
I think that's why it's so significant. The work of the religious dialogue is really important, and you have the Islamic movement of Israel is sitting in the government coalition with Mansour Abbas was the kingmaker, right? And he, the speech she gave after the election was the whole broadcast live at Israeli TV, and he, deciding who the next prime minister would be. Like, it's an incredible moment. And the Islamic movement has tshuva to, sort of creating that Islamic legal justification for a Jewish state, even on land that is, Islamic Holy Land, right? So I think that work is being done. I think that work is being done. Obviously there's a lot of enmity and fear and hatred, and it's not an easy thing to overcome. That's not a simple thing to overcome, but I think that work can be done on both sides, and I think there are people doing it. Because and I think the alternative, either we'll figure out a way to live in peace, or one of us will annihilate the other. Okay, and that's, I think, too awful to contemplate. So we have to figure out a way to live in peace. So whether it's a secular approach or a religious approach, somehow we have to do that. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. You're trying to say something?
No, I'm just enjoying feeling optimistic and pessimistic at the same time. But but really appreciating how you brought this together and like the linear flow from last class, religious justifications, like textual things, like texts that the people that are the most dogmatic, like living in Ofra or wherever, using their own language and sources that you articulated so well, and then bringing that together to like your biggest point now, like this isn't going away. Hashem led us to this land, and there are other human beings in God's image in this same land. And there can't be any other option except one that ends horribly. And then you bring it to that next step of using that religious dialogue for those that are the most dogmatic And then to Linda's point, it needs to be in parity, right?
Mhm,
Because if that step up in religious dialogue as a way to must find a solution isn't done in parity on both sides, then is that a pikuah nefesh issue?
Yeah.
You know,
Sure.
you know, like sheep's and lamb's clothing and things like that, and just, you know, all of that. So I wish you luck in continuing to. And
All right. Thank you,
thanks,
guys.
and
Thank you so
hopefully
much.
you have these partners. Good night. Thank you,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everyone. All right. Goodbye. Thank you.